Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Behnam Ben Taleblu, the senior director of the FDD's Iran program. Behnam, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Brittany.
It seems like, as of now, talks are on between U.S. and Iranian officials for Friday. And that didn't always seem to be the case this week. There was reporting that indicated that these talks were close to collapsing. The United States was ready to walk away. And all of this comes as there are continued tensions between the two countries. They were escalating, they were ratcheting up this week. On Tuesday alone, I want to talk about exactly what we saw. There was two separate incidents. An American fighter jet shot down an Iranian drone that, according to our military, was aggressively approaching a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. Then, in a separate incident just hours later, two Iranian gunboats harassed a U.S. flagged and crewed tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, and according to U.S. Central Command Captain Tim Hawkins, the Iranian ships approached the U.S. one at, quote, high speeds and threatened to board and seize the tanker. As we head into these talks, talk to us about the moment we are in right now.
Well, we are absolutely at a critical juncture in U.S.-Iran relations right now. We're on razor's edge of a potential deal or a potential conflict. I, for one, think a deal is not likely, but nonetheless, the political capital and effort the administration has sunk into trying to get negotiations restarted with the Islamic Republic is here quite noticeable. And we have to say the elephant in the room, deal or war, is that these are following some of the biggest, if not the biggest, nationwide series of protests in the history of the Islamic Republic that actually was the most violently repressed protest movement, not just in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic, but in the past century and a half of contemporary Iranian history, where there has been a battle for power between the street and the state in Iran. Based on open source reports, anywhere from 36,000 to 43,000 Iranians have been killed in protests that went on for a little over 3 weeks, 20 days of which was coterminous with a nationwide internet blackout where the Islamic Republic was killing quite literally civilians in the darkness. And that's why I think here, despite the political effort and capital the Trump administration has sunk into the idea of negotiations with the Islamic Republic, there really is no deal to be had here because not once, not twice, not three times, but eight or nine times speaking about Iran in the month of January, depending on how you count, whether it was on social media or to press or to radio or to TV or from the White House or aboard Air Force One, President Trump drew a red line when it comes to the crackdown from the state against the street in Iran. He promised Iranian protesters that he was locked and loaded, that help was on the way. He told them to continue protesting and to take over their institutions. He told them to take lists of those who were engaging in repression against them, and then ultimately to pivot to nuclear. Uh, there is no strategic, political, or moral logic for that, in my view. And because of that, I fear that in the very, very short to medium term, even the talk of negotiations ends up bolstering the position the Islamic Republic is in right now, meaning Iranian leaders understand that they face the most significant protest movement in their history. And they're keen right now to signal to the population that they have repressed. And also, there have been a reported 50,000 arrested since the protest. They are keen to signal to that population that Uncle Sam, who had promised you that help was on the way, is actually more interested in talking to us about what's left of the nuclear issue than in meaningfully delivering that help. So, no doubt, we are on razor's edge. Things could go hairy in one way or another, but we all do have whiplash from what may come versus the news of will negotiations be rescheduled? What happens if talks are successful? What happens if talks collapse? But certainly, things are dicey. And let me just end with this because you mentioned the two incidents in the Persian Gulf or just outside the Persian Gulf. Um, the Islamic Republic is signaling to America, who has brought forward a ton of military hardware into the region, to make credible those threats, to make credible those red lines that President Trump had drawn. They are signaling that the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz and the entire maritime domain there could be a theater of conflict if there is a larger war. You know, Iranian officials are threatening a region-wide war, no matter if America strikes in a limited way or in a larger way. But this is an area that has not been turned on as a domain or theater of conflict even before October 7th. We saw the maritime tools and tactics of Iran be exported to the Houthis in Yemen, where since October 7, they have uh, attacked international shipping in the Red Sea, the Bab el Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden. But the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are the ones who have developed and perfected those tactics, and they are now signaling to America, who has brought forward a ton more military hardware into the region, that those same tactics could be reapplied in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz in the event of a conflict.
You're the expert here, so I'm really grateful for the time today for you to get us from point A to point B, because the last time you and I talked was about these Iranian protests. So many people, thousands of people killed, thousands of people arrested. They're protesting the Iranian economy. They're protesting the regime. At the time, like you said, President Trump said, help is on the way, keep protesting, MIGA, make Iran great again. And as of now, how did we get from talking about protesting, President Trump saying, if you keep killing protesters, we're not having any meetings with you, we're not coming to the table, to then talking about the nuclear program? Because I can imagine the protesters on the street in Iran were inspired seeing President Trump say, keep protesting, we're with you, help is on the way.
And you're absolutely right to mention that sentiment of the average Iranian protester who, in Persian, when you could get a call out from Iran or look what they could occasionally post on social media when the internet wasn't being throttled, they would all ask, Mizane, is he striking? Will he strike? This is all eyes were on the skies. All eyes were on President Trump. And I think that's actually a position Trump is quite comfortable in, to have both allies and adversaries, both friends and foes, having to be trained on him, having to guess his every next move. We know the president strategically cultivates ambiguity and uncertainty to be able to weaponize that. But again, in Iran, you have fundamentally the most pro American population in the Muslim Middle East, and they are ruled over by the most anti American population in, again, the Muslim Middle East. And these, I would say, with respect, games really can't be afforded to be played at this late stage. But nonetheless, because this is Washington and things are still political, and there's a framing to everything, there's two schools of thought to how did we get here. School of thought A is a little bit more charitable. School of thought B is a little bit less charitable. School of thought A believes that President Trump is indeed looking to make good on his red lines, but doesn't just want the measure for the use of force against Iran to be the human rights situation there, the crackdown from the state against the street. He wants it to be a bit broader, and he wants to have that justification. So he's giving the Islamic Republic something that they would say no to. Therefore, he would be able to perhaps, with greater political ease or greater legal ease, use the military option. That's school of thought A. And to support this, they are bolstered by Trump's track record in 2025, because they believe that, look, Trump was able to signal left and go right and was able to dupe everyone from media to diplomats to the government to everybody else, especially the Iranians, and in the middle of negotiations, be able to go and strike the nuclear program and support Israel in the 12-day war. On the flip side, the less charitable school of thoughts is that, the president has constantly billed himself as a man of peace. He's looking for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's looking to end conflicts, not start conflicts. There is an intellectual and political civil war between isolationists and internationalists in the Republican Party today. President Trump is the only one who can straddle those two very different horses at the same time. Iran policy, Israel policy, Middle East policy is at the nexus of that tension. Oh, and by the way, the president has always wanted a deal. He's not just the commander in chief, he's the negotiator in chief. So he particularly may not be interested in the Iran human rights issue, despite his track record on term one being quite good when it comes to supporting Iranian protesters and torpedoing the conventional wisdom in DC that used to say if you even rhetorically offer support for protesters, that would be the kiss of death. And they're saying that he's merely kind of free riding on the situation to generate pressure to get a nuclear deal that could be better than his political predecessor's nuclear deal. I, for one, think the truth is somewhere in the middle, but perhaps more towards Camp A.
President Trump was asked directly about the protesters in an interview with NBC. The reporter directly asked point blank, the protesters have said, where are the Americans? You promised them we would have their back. Do we still have their back? It seemed like President Trump was a little annoyed by the sentiment that we might not have the Iranian protesters back, because this is what he said. Well, we've had their back. He's added that if we didn't strike some of their nuclear facilities over the summer, we wouldn't have peace in the Middle East. I mean, as you and I sit here right now, what do you make of this in two chunks? One, Do you think that the United States, as of now, has the backs of the Iranian protesters? And B, would you characterize what we're seeing right now as President Trump did, peace in the Middle East?
I would say it like this. We're taking a snapshot rather than taking a video because there's been ebbs and flows both in President Trump's Iran policy and U.S. Iran policy when it comes to standing with and supporting the Iranian people. Again, no doubt President Trump has gone further than any other U.S. president. He really leaned in his statement in early January on Truth Social, that first one about promising to hold those who engage in the crackdown responsible and that the U.S. was locked and loaded. This one statement alone went further in terms of support for the Iranian people than any other US president in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic. That also helped drive the next round of protests. But because the president kept touching that issue, because he kept offering this generous, wholehearted political support, he raised expectations. And that's why, again, the cost would be so heavy for America to, again, back away from the Iranian people as quickly as they had engaged and wanted to support the Iranian people here. And let me perhaps issue a through line of cautious optimism of how political intentions can actually help bolster moral ones. The president drew this red line not about nuclear, not about missile, not about terrorism, but about Iran's domestic situation. And while he's looking now for a nuclear off ramp, of which I don't believe there is one, he nonetheless has the political incentive to actually act on his moral statements. And that political incentive is both in term one and term two. President Trump drew a sharp contrast with his Democratic predecessors on Iran, and in fact was politically animated to move forward his Iran policy because of that difference. In 2009, President Obama didn't support Iran's Green Movement, chose to engage in nuclear diplomacy. In President Trump's first term, 2017 to 2020, he wholeheartedly supported Iranian street protesters any chance he got, such that he had the most popular and the most seen tweet in the history of Persian language Twitter when he tweeted in Persian back in January of 2020. How he can move that forward into support now is if he actually targets Iran's apparatus of repression, if he actually delivers that responsibility, that punishment that Iranians are so now looking to. Iranians are a highly nationalistic population. To get them to turn their eyes to the skies, to get them to ask a foreign power for support and deliverance is huge in the nationalist discourse of Iran, particularly at a time when Iranians have increasingly used nationalism as an ideological weapon against their Islamist and aging authoritarian regime. So President Trump has the opportunity to, again, score a political win to draw a sharp contrast against his predecessors, score a strategic win by actually bolstering American credibility and deterrence. Because lest we forget, 1 year after the botched Obama red line on Syria in 2013, Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. And less than 1 year after the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, Russia invaded eastern Ukraine in 2022. So there is a contagion effect of weakness, of not being able to support your words and looking weak on the world stage. But most importantly, morally and politically, there is a sharp desire to not replicate the talking points of the most anti-American voices who say America only raises expectations but never delivers. So I think if past this prologue, the president will be able to realign here.
To that point, and you saying just how morally and strategic bringing up the protests and having some action on the protests would be, how much do you think they're going to be talked about in these conversations with Iranian and US officials on Friday? Do you think it's going to be a main point of conversation or more of a blip in the larger nuclear program talks?
Well, there haven't been clear political demands as it relates to the fate of the protesters tied to the talks. Most recently, Secretary of State Marco Rubio mentioned the plight of protesters and the human rights situation in Iran. It's unclear as to how that may be nested into the discussions with the Islamic Republic. But lest we forget, there is a debate right now as we speak over what will or won't be discussed. The Iranians are trying to carve out only the nuclear issue. The Trump administration wants to add ballistic missiles, wants to add regional and support for terrorism, and make it a broader package. So the degree to which even the sides are substantively even able to engage on what's on the menu is still at this late stage in the game very much up for debate. But I will say this, at this point in time, there is no negotiation to be had with the Islamic Republic. The only thing they should really be able to do is to negotiate their exit from the political scene in modern Iranian history. And in the short term, if there's negotiations that help push for the releasing of political prisoners and all of those who have been arrested, and to actually meaningfully get people off of death row rather than the stay of execution President Trump believed he got. Was very unfortunate to hear a former senior Iranian official and a current Iranian judiciary official mock the president of the United States for believing that there had been a stay of execution ordered for those 800 plus prisoners that President Trump mentioned. We are in very murky territory at the moment.
And if you believe there's no deal to be had, then why is the United States even engaging in this? Do you think that that's a position U.S. officials have? Because President Trump, he had some tough words for Iran's supreme leader. He said before that if nuclear program talks don't work out, with Iran, probably bad things would happen. He also said that Iran's supreme leader should be very worried. Why are we going into these talks when you're saying, there's not even a deal that's going to be hammered out here?
Perhaps it's leverage for a potential strike to gain further international, legal, and political legitimacy. Perhaps it's again a quest to be, the ultimate deal maker in chief. I think again the president has us right where he wants us, trying to figure out where he may move next. But I want to harp on that last point that you mentioned, which is the recent threat against the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei by the president, because this doesn't come out of a vacuum. Ali Khamenei is someone who has threatened the president, his regime in the end of term one and throughout all the Biden administration has re-upped threats against the life of the president because of the president's successful use of force in 2020, killing Qasem Soleimani, Iran's chief terrorist. The FBI during the Biden administration reported that Iran was trying to assassinate then candidate Trump. Multiple Iranian religious officials have upped fatwas, religious rulings or decrees that have a bounty on the president's head, that actually have a ruling to confiscate his property and to do unspeakable things with the female members of his family. These are religious rulings that come straight from the religious elite of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And more recently, you've had Iranian officials talk about trying to kidnap President Trump, just as the US took President Maduro out of Venezuela. And again, they've talked about even coyly Iranian pro-regime analysts on state television in Iran. If a stray bullet was to strike President Trump during these negotiations, who knows? So President Trump, I think, rightly put the supreme leader on notice. But here's where I would get a little bit worried, because if he's putting the supreme leader on notice in pursuit of a Venezuela-style option, and President Trump recently on Truth Social told Iran that the big, beautiful armada was coming to Iran, much like it had been coming to Venezuela, and that it could swiftly carry out its task. Well, there is fundamentally a major difference between Iran and Venezuela. One, the military capabilities of the Islamic Republic are far greater than Venezuela's, and their track record is they will even take on, as a weaker state, much stronger states. When they fired against US bases in 2020, in 2025, when they fired at Saudi oil in 2019, and when they fired ballistic missiles 3 times at a nuclear armed state, Israel, twice in 2024, once in 2025, and they lived to tell the tale. So they are much more militarily dangerous than Venezuela. They're obviously not at all on the level of the US, but still, it would be somewhat challenging. The next, of course, is the Iranian state is not like the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro. Unfortunately, Khamenei has been able to institutionalize and diffuse his power, so it's never going to be a one and done operation. You're going to have to deal with different political centers of gravity. And third is that Iranian society is not Venezuelan society, with immense respect to Venezuelan protesters and immense respect to Venezuelan civil society. What we just saw in terms of this historic protest movement in Iran had not been happening right before the operation against Maduro in Venezuela. So Iranians have come out onto the streets not for ornamental change at the top, not for musical chairs at the top, but for wholesale change of their government. And based on what's increasingly coming out about the Trump administration being willing to work with what's left of the Maduro regime in Venezuela, that would not at all be an advisable course of action just to take out some symbolic leader and foster change at the top, because that actually will not guarantee peace and stability in the Middle East, because Iranian people do not want to have Uncle Sam on the side of their oppressors.
I want to piece together really every thread we've been talking about. Like we said earlier, President Trump issued some tough words for Iran's leadership. He said that if nuclear program talks don't work out with Iran, probably bad things would happen. He also told NBC that Iran's supreme leader should be very worried. Then we've seen in the last year alone some of President Trump's actions internationally. Over the summer, we saw those strikes on some of Iran's nuclear facilities. Then, completely separately, we saw earlier this year the U.S. attack on Venezuela that led to the capture of the country's sitting leader, Nicolas Maduro. Now we are going in here, and Vice President J.D. Vance, he told Megyn Kelly earlier this week that diplomacy with Iran is very difficult because when there's other countries that the United States has tough, tense relationships with, President Trump can pick up the phone directly. He can call Putin directly. He can call the leaders of North Korea or China and speak with the leader of that country, just him, and have a conversation with him. And he can't do that with Iran. So if diplomacy is tough here, if President Trump issued these stark warnings, and we know at points the president will take action, and that's all paired with the fact that you're saying, I'm not expecting much out of these negotiations. What do you expect to see after?
I think the moment we're in is historic because never has the red light blared this much about the military option. I think there is no way out but through. It is unattractive, it is messy, but compared to the costs of everything else, it actually has the greatest potential to reset US-Iran relations and to put America on better footing to either do what the Trump administration wants, which is to lock down the Western Hemisphere, or to focus on great power competition and strategic competition with China. There is no way to do those things while an Islamic Republic of Iran remains violent at home and aggressive abroad and continues to suck you back in and waste resources into conflict after conflict after conflict in the Middle East. And the more this is potentially delayed, the greater that cost is going to be. That is the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that you seldom get to do well by your head and by your heart in the Middle East. Now, given that this is being forced upon us, this conversation, by the protest movement, by the volume of death that is historic. And when you compare it, unfortunately, there are things that can only a handful of things that compare to the rate of the crackdown in Iran. And that actually comes from World War II, the middle of the Holocaust, Babin Yar in Ukraine in 1941. The rate of the killing in a matter of 2 or 3 days, those numbers that we discussed. So here too, that is history making. And the third is that military force has been tried against the Islamic Republic as well as its proxies since October 7 in fits and starts, and it's actually had some impressive results. The challenge here is how can President Trump nest military force into a larger political strategy? And that's where I think there's still many more questions than answered, because if you are unwilling to think about fundamentally pushing aside the most anti-American regime in the Middle East, you will always be handicapped and settling for a whole host of managing options to manage the Islamic Republic rather than to solve the challenge. But 47 years later, I got to say, given how weak that regime is, it looks like the Islamic Republic has been managing us rather than us managing that threat. And I would say that would be, again, a strategic, moral, and a political mistake for the president to continue that timeline. So I do think military action of some sort is likely. To what end is a real debate right now. Here are some options on the president's table. One option is simply to keep moving more military assets into the region, surge more military assets, sharpen the knife against the neck of the regime, and just leave it there and hope that pressure forces either capitulation or limits the room for maneuver inside the regime. That's one. Two is just some kind of symbolic response. We saw symbolic strikes by the Biden administration in response to Iran-backed Shia militias in Iraq, for example, in Syria as well, perhaps just targeting a few things here or there. It would look like the U.S. used force, but it wouldn't really have any meaningful impact on the ground. The next one up, I would say, is deterrence by punishment, to really punish the apparatus of repression in Iran, to really punish the state. But punishment in and itself isn't a strategy. So how the U.S. could use its destructive military capability for a bigger political strategy remains to be seen. The next one is defang. It could resume the 12-day war, potentially with Israel, to go after the regime's long-range strike capabilities. This would weaken the overall predatory impact of this regime. But at the same time, an open question would be, How does striking a random missile base in Yaz help the average Iranian protester in Tehran or Mashhad? That would be really an open question. Then the next one would be decapitation. Can the US take out not just Khamenei, but a whole host of political elites and help pave the pathway for protesters? Or could the US think of this not just as an operation, but a campaign to do lots of all of this, but ultimately with the goal of getting the security forces to flip? And in this case, military tool, air power, would be a way to try to force and foster regime change with pressure from the top as well as pressure from below, hopefully with renewed street protests. So these are all options on the president's table. Which one he picks, if military force is going to be used, and as we are guessing, it is going to be potentially likely, that right now we don't know.
If there is military action that's going to be used, does that depend on what exactly happens in these talks on Friday? What exactly that will look like, which option he chooses? And specifically after that, I mean, what signposts are you looking for after Friday's meeting to see what are the next moves?
Well, after Friday's meeting, all eyes will be on both Trump and Tehran to see how they try to spin or they try to make sense of what happened in those talks. Is one side framed as asking for too much, while the other side clearly could be looking weak or clearly could be trying to stall or drag out the protests, drag out the negotiations, forgive me. We know this is a tried and true Iranian tactic to ensnare America in process so that it can never actually meaningfully get the results of the negotiations that it actually seeks. I think President Trump's preference for diplomacy is actually very much like President Trump's preference for military action, meaning it needs to be short, sharp, and decisive. And I think if Tehran thinks it can run the clock against the president in 2026, as it did in 2025, well, it might get something that happened after those negotiations ended in 2025, and that was Operation Midnight Hammer. So it's highly likely here that if the President Trump doesn't feel there's a political win to be had with negotiations, you could move to the next option on the table.
Well, there is certainly a lot to look out for. And as we see what's next, I hope that we can have a conversation on what that exactly looks like. Behnam, I always appreciate your perspective, your expertise, our conversations. Thank you so much for joining me. And until next time.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.